All right, welcome back. Our third required foundational document, Federalist No. 51. All right, so our context for this one is a little bit different. The Constitution created a competitive policy-making process to ensure the people's will is accurately represented and that freedom is preserved. So we're looking at competition and how that was created by the Constitution. So again, that's the prism with which we want to be viewing this document. All right, so Madison here in Federalist 51, he starts off, he's talking about a necessary partition of power. That means separation of powers. So we gave some power to the legislative, some power to the executive, and some power to the judicial branch in the Constitution. But then he goes on to talk about how those several constituent parts, meaning each of the three branches, made by means of keeping each other in their proper places. So he wants the branches themselves to be able to control one another, and the term that we use for that is checks and balances. So that's the theme of Federalist 51, is about the need for checks and balances. All right, so this is one of the most popular or famous phrases from Federalist 51, maybe the most popular. He says, ambition must be made to counteract ambition. And in fact, I want you to write down that as your notes. There's just a key phrase that you could see for sure. And what he's talking about is each of the branches have their own ambition for their own power, for their own glory, for themselves, for their branch to be more important. And so one way that you kind of offset that natural ambition is to give somebody else ambition that can counteract or it can influence and check the others. So give each of them some power and let each of them check the others. And he says that that will help to keep any one of them from getting too strong. And he'll go on to explain this a little bit more, but I wanted you to have that quote. All right, so he says here, this is my favorite part, is this section. He's talking about how it's human nature, what we're talking about here. If men were angels, no government would be necessary. So if we were all perfect, we were divine, we wouldn't need to have a government to make laws and tell us right from wrong, put us in prison, all that kind of stuff. But we aren't angels, therefore we need a government. But then there's a second problem, is that the people in government aren't angels either. So if angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. So you'd have a perfect government and you would just say, here's your power, and it would naturally use its power properly. But since we have a government of men, by men over men, and women, obviously updating it a couple hundred years, you first have to enable the government to control the governed. So government has to have enough power to control the people, but it also needs to be obliged or manage to control itself. So you have to influence it, encourage it to control itself. So this is what's a really tough part. We need government because people aren't perfect, but then we need to limit government because the people in government aren't perfect either. So we're going to need to have limited governmental power. Again, one of the key ideas of the Constitution is this limited government, and here he's giving you a really good reason why. Now here is just an observation. And again, this is different than it is today. Unit 2 is going to go into this in great detail. But originally, Congress was thought to be the strongest branch. So he says the legislative authority necessarily predominates. We know that's not true today, but it was in 1787. So he says the remedy is to divide the legislature into different branches. So in other words, we have a bicameral, two-house legislature in part to weaken Congress. So instead of giving one body all of the congressional and legislative powers, we divide it into House and Senate. So this is a check within a check. Again, another really important feature of our Constitution and our government. All right, so now he's going to go on and talk about how we have power separated in multiple ways. So we have this Republican form of government, but in the compound Republic of America, he's talking about federalism. So he doesn't use that term, but he says the compound republic of federalism. You can look, if you go on, you can get how this means federalism. He says the power surrendered by the people is first divided between two distinct governments. That would be the national government or federal government and the state government in which they live. So we have a federal system that divides power, but then we apportion the portion allotted to each is subdivided among those two different governments. So we have federalism, divides power between national and state governments, and then within the federal government we now subdivide or separate powers even further among the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. So he says a double security arises to the rights of the people. So he's arguing that because of federalism and separation of powers together, we are absolutely protecting the rights of the individual. So now we turn to the idea of minority rights again, just like in Federalist number 10. And here he says, talking about how having many groups, so this is back to that pluralism or pluralist democracy, breaking society into so many different parts, interests of the rights, the minority will be in little danger from interested combinations of the majority. So this is kind of rehashing what he said in number 10 already in much more detail, but having many groups competing for power, many factions, pluralism, whatever term you want to think of, but he argues again that this will protect minority rights. This is kind of a footnote in this one, but it should be noted. Again, this isn't the main idea, but he says justice is the end of government. This is the kind of phrase that might give us trouble in 2018, 2019, 2020, and here in the 21st century. In other words, what does he mean when he says justice is the end of government? Well, in this case, he's talking about something being the ends. It means that it is the goal. It is the purpose. So the end of government, the purpose of government is justice. So that's why I've written there, purpose of government is to establish justice. So that's kind of our starting point. That's the goal of government, justice. And so separation of powers, checks and balances will help us to have justice. All right. Remember, subscribe, hit that like button if this video helped you at all. If you're going to score 1 point better on your test, hit that like button for me. This has been a La Money production.